The three things that we can do something about are what I call the primary pathological triad. It's number one, and that's probably the most important. The second is a lingering pathogen of some sort. Because once you've got a lingering pathogen in the system, you've got this constant conflict between the jung qi and the pathogen. And the third one is this disconnection between the heart-kidney axis, which is the thermoregulation system of the body, the water-fire balance.
I'm Michael Max, and this is Qiological, the podcast for practitioners and students of acupuncture and East Asian medicine. If you're new here, welcome. And if you're a regular listener, I've got a great conversation with Will Maclean coming up today. By the way, if you're familiar with Will's writing, Eastland Press has a new edition of the Clinical Handbook of Internal Medicine coming out, and you can snag it with a discount for another week or two. Pop on over to the podcasts page on the website and click on the Eastland Press icon for details. If you listen to the podcasts here for any length of time, you'll know that I've got an interest in marketing. Actually, what I have is an interest in how people connect with each other, make meaning, and create sense in their world, which is partly what attracted me to the practice of medicine in the first place. I've also got this interest in what I like to think of as first principles, the stuff that underlies any process or manifestation. Kind of like us East Asian medicine practitioners think of yin and yang, or the resonant manifestation of the five phases. First principles are not like scripts, hacks, or shortcuts, which I suspect are of limited value, as those focus on results rather than on process. First principles in the area of marketing are the building blocks of how we make meaning and how we communicate with those that we wish to serve. You have probably heard me talk about Seth Godin, Uncle Seth as I like to think of him. He's the smart and funny uncle I wish I had had as a kid. I recently read his latest book, This is Marketing, and I want to tell you something. It's not a book about marketing. Reading this book could change how you interact with your spouse, dial down your activity to those idiots over there, and open your sense of inquiry into situations that seem confusing and without a lick of logical sense. If all you learned from reading this book is, it's for them, it's not for you, then this book would have been worth your time. I think this has been one of those reoccurring lessons that's come around for me as a business person. It's come around again and again. For a long time, I thought I could help everybody with acupuncture. What I've come to discover is I can't. Understanding it's for them, it's not for you, not only lets me take myself off the hook, it lets the people who may not be ready to use our medicine, it lets them off the hook too. It's not a failure on anyone's part, and it saves a lot of wasted time and emotion. And beyond the arena of marketing our practices, I found that pausing for a moment to remember it's not for me, it's for them. This helps me to better understand aspects of life and culture that don't make any sense to me. Like, stadium sports, small dog sneaky tofu, or Kia Soul cars. I think it just comes down to honest differences. Differences that separate us into dissimilar crowds. But consider this. Wherever there's an outside, there's also an inside. And I'm reminded by Uncle Seth's work that we can focus and be generous with the inside, with those who we wish to serve. And we do it best, not when we try to exclude others, but recognize that there are those who just aren't interested, and not waste our valuable time or energy trying to change them. It's not for them. Keep your attention on those who our work is for, and help them with the changes that they want to make. One last thing about marketing. I'm still looking for someone who genuinely loves doing health fairs, and it shows in your paycheck too. I'd love to have a conversation with you here on the podcast. Again, it's an area that's completely out of my introvert's area of interest, but I'd like to better understand how these situations can be helpful for some people. Ping me if this is your ballywhack. These conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members, All the sponsors here provide helpful products or services that you'll find beneficial in your clinical work. Want to get better at treating concussions and other neurological conditions? Clayton Shoe has some innovative methods. Blue Poppy, your new one-stop shop, has speedy shipping options on everything that you need for your clinic. Later in the show, Jane offers you helpful suggestions on how to raise your rates, and Golden Flower Chinese Herbs shares a journey of healing that I think you'll recognize. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Geological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast. Picture this. Your clinic is buzzing with patients, and then you realize that you're down to your last box of needles. No need for panic, because Blue Poppy, your one-stop shop for all your acupuncture needs, they ship orders received before 3 p.m. on the same day. With a quick visit to Blue Poppy's website, you can order premium needles, herbal formulas, and that special Dr. Bob's oil that your patients love. Blue Poppy understands practitioners can't keep patients waiting. That's why they strive to get you what you need when you need it. From high-quality Chinese herbs and formulations to acupuncture supplies and clinical essentials, Blue Poppy has served practitioners for nearly 40 years with products that meet the highest of standards. Discover everything Blue Poppy has to offer by visiting www.bluepoppy.com, and don't forget to subscribe to their mailing list for exclusive offers and more. Ever found yourself listening to a geological conversation and thinking, wow, I needed to hear that? Yeah, me too. And I never know when I'm going to hear a guest say something that stops my world and reboots it with a larger perspective. If these conversations have ever helped you to feel more grounded, more inspired, or just less alone in this strange and wonderful work we do, consider becoming a member or supporting the podcast with a bit of tithing to the donation jar. It helps keep the lights on here at the Geological Sound and Motion Lab so that we can bring you these conversations every Tuesday morning. You'll find all the details at geological.com. Thanks for listening and for being a part of this.
Hey there, I'm Cameron Jafari, an acupuncturist from Los Angeles. So I started learning nanopuncture from Dr. Clayton Shoe because I was facing these complex neurological conditions like stroke and MS in my clinic, and I just felt like I lacked a solid process to treat them. Brain-related issues always felt like a whole different animal, and I was looking for a clinical system that worked and could guide me through them. So after attending my first nanopuncture seminar, I was able to apply the process pretty quickly and with pretty amazing results. I remember the first stroke patient I saw afterwards was a guy who had had a stroke 2 years back, and he couldn't talk at all. And after a few treatments, he started saying a few words. And a few treatments after that, he could actually have conversations. It was pretty incredible. So this is why I feel like nanopuncture is the future of acupuncture neurology. And you can be a part of that. Their next seminar is on treating concussions and is being co-taught by both Dr. Shoe and Dr. Ayla Wolf in New York City on April 26th and 27th. To learn more, visit nanopunctureseminars.com.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Geological. My guest today is Will Maclean. Will is a long-time 30-year practitioner down in Australia. He's currently on sabbatical, where he's doing some work on one of his books. He is trained both in Australia and did some time in Hangzhou, China. In addition to teaching internationally, he is the co-author of a veritable library of books on Chinese medicine, including the 3-volume series titled Clinical Handbook of Internal Medicine, which, by the way, we will be talking about later in the show. Will, welcome to Geological.
Thanks, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited to be talking to you. You know, I'm excited to talk to everybody that's on my show. Imagine that. I'm the one who invites them.
Thing.
I think so, too. So you've done a lot of books. You've done a lot of writing. You know, we were talking earlier before we turned on the tape. A book is a lot of work, and you've got more than a few.
Yeah.
And anyone that hasn't done a book probably doesn't know the incredible effort that goes into it. I'm a little curious.
Indeed.
Yeah. What has incited you? Whatever got you started with writing books in the first place?
Well, it was really practical because I was teaching at one of the colleges in Sydney not too long after I graduated. In fact, I think I started teaching at about 1991, 92, something like that. in those days, there just wasn't very much material. I was teaching a course on internal medicine, amongst other things, but the source materials that I'd learnt when I was at school were pretty poor. They didn't really reflect the clinical reality that I was starting to observe in practice. So I started to compile course notes, things that I thought were a bit more realistic. I had some good source materials that I'd picked up in China when I was there. My Chinese was improving. So I started slowly to compile a series of lectures on internal medicine.
So it was really your class notes in a sense.
Yeah, basically, that's how it started. The first volume was certainly compiled from class notes. And then, of course, over time, as I got more and more experience in practice, those course notes became modified by what I was seeing. There was often quite an interesting divergence between the original Chinese materials and what the reality of a Western clinical practice was.
I think this is something that we all go through. I certainly know that I did, where we learn this theory, we learn some stuff, we get through school, and it's actually really curious when someone walks in and actually fits what we studied in school, because most people don't.
That's right. It's in a unique situation. You think, oh, wow, maybe there is something in this after all.
I often think I'm clearly missing something here because this just fits the book.
Yes, but that particular incompatibility just became more and more clear over a period of time. But anyway, that's where the book started from. That was where the first volume started from.
It's sort of your journey with understanding clinical practice.
Originally, it was all going to go into one book, but, internal medicine is really a huge and complicated field. So the first book only covered 4 of the organ systems. That's all we could actually physically print, basically.
Well, unless you put wheels on the thing.
Yeah, that's right. It came to 1,000 pages or something. And I think in those days, the physical limit was around about 1,000 pages for the paper type that we had. So my dream of having it all in one got thrown out pretty early. So we went for a second volume, thinking that would be the end. And then, of course, it just keeps on going. It grew like Topsy, essentially. And in fact, with the new edition, it's grown again.
Earlier, we were talking about inflammation. Inflammation's a big thing these days. It's in the news a lot. I'd really like to hear your thoughts about inflammation, how it looks in Chinese medicine, what we do with it. What are you thinking about this stuff?
Inflammation, particularly chronic inflammation, has been one of my major clinical and research interests for the last probably 10 years, I would say, just because it appears to be so phenomenally common. This is not just from a general medical point of view, but from a Chinese medical point of view. So many of my patients present with what we would describe as some type of heat complex, which is giving rise to at least a portion of their problem and a whole bunch of their symptoms. And let me go back a little bit. I've worked in a number of different practices. And one particular practice that I worked in was a general medical practice with GPs and osteopaths and a whole bunch of other people. And we used to cross-refer a great deal between each other. And I would end up getting a lot of patients with autoimmune diseases referred to me because the treatment, as you know, for autoimmunity, at least this is probably 20 years ago, wasn't especially good. It was steroids, methotrexate, immunosuppressants, and patients would often end up feeling worse than they did initially with all of the drugs, and they weren't really well controlled and so on and so forth. So I was exposed to a lot of patients with so-called autoimmune diseases. And one of the things that they generally had in common from a Chinese medicine point of view was this persistent heat. They had some degree of heat somewhere, whether it was in their warm, swollen, painful joints or in the skin problems that they had, which were sort of red and raised and whatever it might be, ulcerations of the oral cavity, the whole bunch of different examples of that. But heat was the consistent finding. And as you do as a practitioner, you think, okay, well, what do I do here? I have to clear away heat. We can clear away heat. That's not a problem. There's lots of ways to do that. And patients would often get somewhat better, but it always seemed to come back. They'd stop the treatment, they'd go away, they'd come back a few months later, and everything had returned in much the same sort of fashion. So the problem seemed to me that it wasn't just getting rid of heat. What the hell is the heat doing? Where is it coming from in the first place? That was the initial thing that got me started on that. I had one particular patient, a lady with an autoimmune disease called Behçet's disease, also known as Silk Road disease. You familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with that one. Tell us about it.
Very unpleasant disease. There's a strong genetic component to it. It runs in a band from China across to Turkey, and it was first described by a Turkish physician. Anyway, it's characterized by very unpleasant ulceration of the oral cavity, the genitals, and the eyes, as well as joint pains and, fevers and all the rest of this sort of stuff. Now, with this lady, we were clearing heat to deal with her symptoms as much as possible. Nothing was happening. Nothing was really doing anything. And I ramped up the treatment quite considerably. We started using much more hardcore medications. In fact, I ended up using a thing called Legongtang. Are you familiar with that? It's a
yeah.
It's a Cryptorigium Will 40. And it's actually used from a Western medical point of view. It's an immunosuppressant. It's a vine. And it's used fairly extensively in China for autoimmune problems.
Isn't it a bit toxic?
Yes, it is. You've got to monitor liver function while your patients are taking it. She was dedicated to treatment and she gave this a go. Nothing. We weren't getting anywhere. And I really like this patient. Sometimes you really have a special empathy with certain, you try to have empathy with all your patients, of course. But this lady had some small kids and I really liked her a lot. And she was dedicated to her treatment as well. So we went back to original materials to try and find some answer. And as it turns out, this particular disease was described in the Jingui Yaloway. It's a thing called hidden fox, Huhuabing.
Huhuabing, hidden fox disease.
Yeah. Anyway, the solution given by Zhang Zhongjing to this was a harmonizing prescription, a thing called Ganqiao Xiexintang.
Uh-huh.
And you think, okay, well, what's going on there? She's full of heat. She's burning up. She's got inflamed joints. She's got all this ulceration. She's hot all the time. Ganqiao Xiexintang is not really a heat-clearing formula. What's the rationale?
Very harmonizing, yes.
And, of course, Zhang does not give any rationale for its use. But I thought, look, we'll give it a go and see what happens. I'm running out of ideas. So we tried it, and it made a difference. Not a huge one, but it made a difference.
What were the initial things that shifted from this?
Well, she felt better in general. That sort of overall sense of well-being improved. She wasn't feeling so terribly distressed. Her oral ulcerations improved somewhat. Her joints, while still fairly uncomfortable, were also slightly better. She had one knee which was really a problem, and her wrists were a problem, so it was terrible for her to pick up her children. And that improved slightly too. Now, these weren't dramatic by any means, but there was a qualitative shift that we hadn't been able to achieve doing anything else. And that really got me thinking about what was the rationale, what's behind this thinking here. Anyway, that started the process. I mean, basically, when you've got this sort of heat, you have to discover the source of the heat. That's the only way to really move forward with treatment. Where is that heat coming from and why is it being continually created over and over again? The more you clear it, fine, you get rid of it, but it comes back.
Right. Something is smoldering.
Something is smoldering. Something is continually producing this heat. So that was the starting point for thinking a bit more deeply about the problem. And then over the years, with a lot more research and a lot more clinical experience, I came to the conclusion that there are three major sources of this persistent heat in the body. And this seems to be reasonable. It's a model, so I'm not claiming that it's the answer by any means, but it's certainly been a very helpful guiding principle in my practice over the years. And the three sources of heat are, without going into too much technical detail.
Well, you know what? This is a show for practitioners. We can go as deep and geeky as you want to go.
Let me go back. There are actually 6 sources of persistent heat, but 3 that we can do something practical about, we can actually intervene with in our practice. The 3 that we can't really do a whole lot about, there's a constitutional component. Patients who have a liver fire or a heart fire type constitution, they seem to be prone to developing heat type pathology as they get older. And there's not a whole lot you can really do about that in my experience. Diet is also extremely important. And, you just put too much fuel in. It's like a compost heap, which gets hot, basically. And my experience is manipulating people's diet is one of the hardest things to do in practice.
I'm a real failure at getting people to change their diets.
It's very, very difficult. The 3 things that we can do something about are what I call the primary pathological triad. It's number 1, and that's probably the most important. The second is a lingering pathogen of some sort. Because once you've got a lingering pathogen in the system, you've got this constant conflict between the jiangqi and the pathogen, which creates its own source of heat, which creates the fire of battle, if you like, the conflict of battle. And the third one is this disconnection between the heart-kidney axis, which is the thermoregulation system of the body, the water-fire balance. Right? So if that heart-kidney axis is out of whack for some reason, then either there's not enough water to control the fire, or the fire just gets out of control on its own accord, and then you get this persistent level of heat. And they all have their own signatures, clinical signatures, which you can identify fairly clearly in practice, but they all end up causing rather similar looking clinical profiles. They all generate heat. They all generate ongoing heat. And unless you deal with the underlying reason, if you don't get rid of the lingering pathogen that's there, or you don't balance out the triad in some way, or try and reestablish the connection between the heart and kidney, basically all you're doing is putting a Band-Aid on the heat, and it will keep on coming back.
Right, which is what Western medicine does.
Yeah, basically. Exactly. In fact, most treatments do seem to just put a Band-Aid on it. And that's certainly what I was doing by just clearing heat all the time. It wasn't really doing the job.
I'm not familiar with this primary triad that you're speaking about, or maybe I am, but I don't know it by that name. What is the primary triad?
Basically, it's a very simple concept. It's essentially the relationship between the liver and spleen, one of the major primary axes of the body, and how that relationship, when broken down, starts to generate some type of heat. Right? So the triad is dysfunction of the liver, dysfunction of the spleen, and the generation of heat. It's those 3 points of the triangle. And the interesting thing about that is that once the triad of pathology is established, once the liver and spleen are out of balance and the heat's been created, it tends to be self-perpetuating.
Mm-hmm.
And you can deal with one point on the triad, like clearing away the heat, but unless you deal with all three at once, the whole thing just keeps on going. It rolls around and reestablishes itself. This was one of my seminal insights, I think, as far as my own practice is concerned. You would see patients with this mix of pathology, some sort of liver pathology, chi stagnation, some sort of spleen dysfunction, deficiency, or damp, or phlegm, or something along those lines, and some type of heat, and focus on strengthening the spleen perhaps, or regulating the liver, or clearing away heat, and the patient would get a bit better, but then it would come back again. That was a consistent finding in my practice. You really never got satisfactory long-term clinical outcomes. And it wasn't until I put this together in my own head, there's nothing new, of course. I mean, this has been described in the literature, but I got the hang of it that I started to see the rationale for the concept of harmonization and how that then fits back into what we were talking about before, Zhang Zhongjing's insight in using Ganqia Xie to treat hidden fox disease, which is characterized by masses of heat.
And this is a situation here with the liver and spleen imbalance where harmonization would be really helpful.
Absolutely. Harmonization is the strategy. And of course, the primary pathological triad is so common because the modern lifestyle is essentially tuned to upsetting it. Sedentary life, increasingly sedentary habits, which mucks up the spleen, crummy diet, which also mucks up the spleen, certain medications, which muck up the spleen, financial, global, emotional, family stresses of various sorts, which impact on the liver, additives and preservatives in foods, medications also, which muck up the liver, the endless looking at screens, which damages liver blood, people staying up late at night, which mucks up the liver because the liver is, of course, involved in regulating all of the various cycles, the day-night cycle, the menstrual cycle, and so on and so forth. So there's many ways to impede the liver and the spleen, largely lifestyle-based. And once that relationship's out of whack, then it's so easy to generate heat because you've got chronic chi stagnation. You often generate some degree of stagnant heat. When the spleen's out of whack, it generates damp, and the heat that's there can interact with the heat, and you've got damp heat. Heat will eventually damage yin, so you end up with yin deficiency plus the heat. So it becomes quite a complicated scenario. But I have found that the primary pathological triad is at the base of so much pathology in my clinical practice. Now, I can only speak for my practice. Everyone's practice is different. I have attracted over the years a certain type of patient. So I've got a certain clinical bias, of course. It may well be different in other people's practices, but the understanding of the primary pathological triad and, of course, lingering pathogens and the heart-kidney axis issue really revolutionized the way that I saw chronic inflammatory problems, and I saw a lot of them.
This episode is brought to you by Jane, the clinic management software that I use to keep my practice running smoothly. So, let's talk about something that can be a little bit uncomfortable, raising your fees. I know, this is something that might feel awkward, but it doesn't have to. With a bit of planning and care, you can handle it in a way that feels right for you and your patients. One tip, give yourself at least 2 months to prepare. This gives you time to get comfortable with the change and let your patients know what's happening. You can share the news through emails, booking reminders, or even just a friendly little sign in your clinic, and avoid over-apologizing. Instead, keep it straightforward and matter of fact. Keeping things consistent across the ways that you communicate can really help avoid confusion. Fee increases aren't always easy, but you're not on your own here. For more tips and ideas on how to communicate these changes with confidence, check out frontdesk.chain.app and look for the article, How to Tell Your Clients You're Raising Your Fees. Oh, and one last thing, if you're ready to give Jane a try, use the code CHEOLOGICAL for a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. It makes a lot of sense. I want to get into some of these other ones here in just a moment. And I can see how the Ganzhao Tang would really fit in there. And to me, I got a big smile on my face because I've done a fair amount of study with Dr. Huang, and one of his favorites for ulcers that go anywhere along mucosal membranes from the mouth to the anus to the vagina, Ganzhao Tang.
Yeah.
And as we're having this conversation, it's great. I'm getting another point of view and going, oh, I can really see the beautiful harmonization. It's a fairly gentle formula.
Yes.
And when we see these situations with lots of heat and inflammation and, big sores, and you're like, this is going to take care of that? What? It's extraordinary. It really makes us think about pathomechanisms.
Absolutely. And, this is the interesting thing I think about, for me, about Chinese medicine is the detective component of it. The puzzle solving.
Yes.
But to solve puzzles, you need to have a lot of material. You need to have a lot of background material in your head that you can draw upon, a lot of different models to draw upon.
We were talking about this earlier before we got on the line about you've been in practice 30-ish years. I'm in my 20th year. And I was saying how I was reading something recently, fairly basic stuff. I don't know how many nth time I've been reading it, but it comes through and it's like, wow, I really get it. And I'm thinking, why did it take this long to get it? And I think you're really putting your finger on something here. There's this iterative process. We have to see something again and again and again.
Absolutely.
In a variety of contexts.
Chinese medicine is very much a holistic, or I should say holographic is what I meant to say, system, whereby each piece of information doesn't really mean anything on its own. It only means something in relationship to many other pieces of information. And as you gather experience and your information base expands, then each individual piece of information starts to take on a different meaning within the context of your expanding knowledge base. So many things you won't get until you've seen hundreds or thousands of patients with a particular sort of problem, because you just don't have that background knowledge to draw upon. And it's like the pulse. You really can't get the pulse, I don't think, until you've matched pulse states with thousands of patients. It's that physical memory of something tied to an observation. And doing that over and over and over again is when you start to think, oh, yeah, now I can see where that pulse is coming from. What that actually means, because I've seen it over and over and over and over and over again.
Staying with this primary triad for a moment, we talked about the Ganzhao Tang. What are some of your other strategies, thoughts, or formulas, or even acupuncture for working on this particular piece?
From a herbal point of view, the strategies are almost always they're always drawn from the harmonizing group of formulas. But that's a really broad category of formulas, and the intent of a harmonizing formula is to deal with all 3 points of the triad at the same time. Now, in practice, what you see is that patients will tend to skew towards one corner of the triangle, depending on where they are in their life. It's a dynamic process. So from treatment to treatment, it can change. And that's what you want it to do. You want it to change from time to time. So you can track where they're at, depending on their life, their diet, their emotional world, their work habits, and so on and so forth. They might swing between having more heat or more component of qi constraint or more spleen issues. So all of those harmonizing prescriptions are aimed at dealing with different combinations, if you like, of the three pathologies. Now, another thing that informed me in this particular area was the understanding of Xiao Chai Hu Tang. Now, everyone knows Xiao Chai Hu Tang, certainly one of the most interesting prescriptions in the materia medica, and one of the most widely used. In fact, my understanding is that in Japan, Xiao Chai Hu Tang is the number one formula manufactured in granules.
I've heard that as well.
And it used to, before I understood the process, it confused me. I couldn't work out what was going on because my understanding of Xiao Chai Hu Tang was that it's for Xiaoyang syndrome. You know, Xiaoyang syndrome being a post-infectious stage, a week or so after someone's had some upper respiratory tract problem or whatever it might be, they lapse into a Xiao Chai Hu Tang conformation, which was fine, but it didn't explain why so many people were using Xiao Chai Hu Tang. And it wasn't until I started to look at this in the context of the primary pathological triad that it all started to make sense. And as it turns out, when you look at the triad, if you imagine a triangle with liver pathology, spleen pathology, and heat, and we've got a whole bunch of harmonizing formulas which are aimed to deal with this particular mix of pathology, it turns out that Xiao Chai Hu Tang does a bit of each of those. It regulates the liver. It's got Chai Hu in it, so it regulates liver qi. It strengthens and protects the spleen. It has Ren Chen, Gan Chao. It clears heat. It has Huang Qin. So it does a bit of each of these necessary balancing steps without doing too much of any. So when you map formulas according to their therapeutic bias, Xiao Chai Hu Tang essentially maps pretty much right in the middle. So it's the most well-balanced of all of the harmonizing prescriptions when it comes to tuning up the primary pathological triad. And as it turns out, primary pathological triad is such an incredibly common mix of pathology in the clinic that you could actually go into clinic and just give everyone Xiao Chai Hu Tang and your strike rate would probably be pretty good, even without knowing what you're doing, because most people feel a bit better.
It's like it's a broad spectrum harmonizer.
Exactly. That's exactly right. If you've got a bit more heat in the system, you'd want to go somewhere else. Jiawei Xiaoyao or Zhongman Fenxiao Wan or something along those lines.
I'm not familiar with that one.
That's one of the most interesting formulas. It's used for drum distension. Drum distension is a type of ascites.
And what's the name of it again?
Zhongman Fenxiao Wan. Yeah, it's traditionally considered to be it's a purgative formula which clears away fluid from the abdomen. But it in fact is a harmonizing formula. The definition of harmonizing prescriptions is that they're often quite complicated prescriptions. They combine herbs with opposing actions. So they'll have very cold and very hot herbs together. For example, shugao and futsa, or ganjiang and huang qin, that sort of thing. They'll combine herbs with opposing natures, bitter, sweet, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, we see that one a lot in Bansha Xixin Tang.
Oh, yes, I love that.
I go through that stuff like crazy around here.
Absolutely. That's been a mainstay of my practice over the years too. And exactly for that very same reason. It balances the primary pathological triad. That's the way that I look at it. Right? It's got ganjiang, it's got huang qin. Those opposing herbs, they drive dynamic movement within the body. You've got the hot herbs, which elevate qi, lift up spleen qi, improve the spleen and its ability to move things upwards. You've got the bitter cold of the Huang group, the Huang Qins, Huang Lians, Huang Bais, which cause qi to move downwards. So automatically you're setting up this sort of dynamo of movement, this driving physical movement of qi.
I sometimes think of it as like really turning a heavy flywheel. These are the herbs that give it some torque, really give it some energy to set it in motion.
Yes, indeed. Well, that's how all of these harmonizing formulas actually really work. That's the way that I think about them anyway. They drive physical processes rather than just thinking about them tonifying the spleen or regulating the liver or clearing away heat. They stimulate movement. And in fact, I think most of the really interesting formulas in the materia medica do much the same sort of thing. They work like acupuncture. They drive the movement of qi, essentially.
They're really dynamic.
Yeah, Shui Fu Jiatang does the same thing. It's not a harmonizing formula, but the combination of Jiagan and Niu Shi together. Niu Shi pulls things down, Jiagan lifts them up. You've got the pivot, the dynamo.
Then you tonify the blood a bit and you move the blood and you move the chi with that formula. It's another one, kind of a big heavy hitter when you think about it. It's moving everything.
I couldn't imagine a practice without that one. That's been another mainstay of my practice over the years.
I'm curious about the heart-kidney connection. Is this something that you would say is more emotionally based?
Very often, yes.
Tell us a bit about what you see with that one and which formulas help set that particular mechanism correct again.
To go backwards a little bit, the heart-kidney axis and the liver-spleen axis are the two main axes of the body. Now, the liver-spleen axis is for generating the daily chi we require for daily activities and physiology, normal physiology, whereas the heart-kidney axis is your deeper axis. It's the relationship between your template, your jing, and how you perceive the world through the shen and how normal your perception is, essentially. The liver-spleen axis is easily mucked up. Most people have experienced that. You get upset and you get a knot in your stomach. That's a liver-spleen disharmony.
There you go. Mm-hmm.
But the heart-kidney axis being so critical to our ability to form memories and our ability to see the world clearly and therefore reproduce, which is, ultimately what it's all about from an evolutionary point of view, is a very robust axis, very hard to break, very hard to disrupt. But it gradually becomes weakened as you get older, as your yin is consumed by living. The heart-kidney axis does become more fragile and is easier to disrupt. However, in younger people who are robust, it takes a great deal of emotional trauma to really make a significant impact on it. And this is where it gets interesting in clinic, because there's a group of disorders which occur when someone has had a major psychological trauma. Now, this can be a major car accident or some type of severe emotional shock. Right? The heart-kidney axis is disrupted by severe emotional trauma. So what we observe is the development of certain types of pathology which reflect a disruption of the heart-kidney axis, generally 6 to 9 months after a big shock. Someone's spouse dies, or they were in a car accident and they thought they were going to die, whatever it might be. In Australia, some years ago, we had some very big bushfires in Melbourne called the Kinglake fires, and a lot of people were killed. And we saw some patients after that who had terrible problems with their heart-kidney axis because of the terrible trauma of that experience.
So PTSD would fall into this category as well then?
Yes, PTSD certainly can. But there's a very specific set of physical symptoms that emerge out of this, and very often they overlap with endocrine problems in Western medical sense. So, for example, dysfunction of the thyroid is quite a common experience. So hyperthyroid problems, be one example of disconnection between the heart and kidney. The kidney water is not containing heart fire anymore. So we end up with this sort of flaring of heart fire, which manifests in all the heat, the tachycardia, the insomnia, tremors, the Shen disturbances, and so on and so forth, which are characteristic of the body's ability to regulate its internal temperature. People get really hot and can't cool down. Then they get cold and can't warm up. So they have dysfunction of thermoregulation.
Would you also see this to some degree with hypothyroid people? But in this case, it's more that the heart fire has been extinguished, and so you've got more kidney water.
It can go the other way as well. When the heart-kidney axis gets disrupted, and this is discussed in the Shanghan Lun as well, I think it's a Shanghan. When you get disruption to the heart-kidney axis, it can go one of two ways, into what's called heat transformation or cold transformation. The heat transformation is more common in my experience, but the cold transformation is certainly there as well. And they ultimately look, to all intents and purposes, like heart and kidney yin deficiency or heart and kidney yang deficiency. So yes, cold transformation is common. In women, it seems to be much more common that it is the heat transformation, and in men, it's slightly more common that it's a cold transformation.
I'm thinking about so many women I've seen in my practice who have thyroid issues.
Yeah.
And primarily hypothyroid. Maybe they're just a little hypothyroid. It's a little off. And I hadn't put this together until we're having this conversation right now. But I'm wondering if there's, as women have often experienced trauma, that there's some hidden trauma there that's depressing that heart fire, that's increasing that kidney water, and there goes the heart-kidney axis.
What actually often happens, it seems, is that the initial response to some sort of traumatic experience, if that's what's causing it, it's not always that. you have to remember that as you get older, the heart-kidney axis becomes more fragile. Right? After 40, half your yin's gone. So the axis is really robust in your 20s and 30s, but as you hit your 40s, 50s, and 60s, the axis becomes naturally more fragile. So it takes less and less of a trauma to actually start to disrupt it. Even without any sort of traumatic experience, the axis ultimately becomes disrupted anyway. One of the manifestations of a poor relationship between the heart and kidney is the inability to form short-term memories, because the heart-kidney axis is critical in the ability to form memory in the first place. It's the relationship between the spleen, heart, and the kidneys. The spleen being the perception, or being the focus of attention on something to be remembered. The Shen, the perception, of course, and the storage in the kidney. But if that process isn't working very well, then people can't form these short-term memories. And of course, that's incredibly common as you get older and older. That's just a natural part of that disruption.
Hi, this is Dr. Sky Sturgeon with Mayway Herbs. So the basic question is, how do I know how many tea pills to prescribe? The answer is, it depends. Mayway's standard dose is 24 pills per day, but you should rely on your clinical judgment. If 24 pills seems like too many, realize that 24 pills is about equal to 9 to 12 grams of a raw herb formula. Also, you may want to adjust the dosage up or down depending on your patient's weight, because the standard dose is for a 125-pound adult. Other factors to consider are the severity of the condition, whether the condition is acute or chronic, excess or deficiency, your patient's age, constitution, the presence of other health issues, and other factors based on your clinical assessment. For more information, check out Determining the Right Dosage for Your Patient on Mayway.com by Laura Strokes.
So when you're thinking chronic inflammation and it's the heart-kidney axis, what are some of the kind of issues that show up? And then what are some of the formulations that you found helpful?
Well, in terms of inflammation, it's almost always, of course, the heat transformation, the yin damage component of it. So not enough kidney water, heart fire starts to flare. But of course, one of the things that happens with heat is that it's a very yang pathogen, so it tends to dissipate over time. So even though if someone had quite a significant degree of heat initially, that will naturally wane as time goes by. So the more chronic the pathology becomes, the more muted the heat component becomes as well. When there is this persistent heat as a result of the heart-kidney axis, there's a number of ways you can address the problem. But my favorite is the standard formulation. It's Tianwang Bushindan is another one of the standout formulas.
Oh man. I order that stuff in by the wheelbarrow load. That is that is an amazing prescription.
It is. It's a remarkable prescription, and it's for exactly this, heart-kidney disconnection or a weakening of the heart-kidney axis. A very, very common problem, of course, as you well know.
Yes.
As I said, it doesn't have to be traumatic. As you get older, it weakens naturally, so a small upset can often be enough to tip the balance. But in a younger person, in their 20s, you would expect to find some more significant trauma, unless, of course, they were born with some diminishment of their jing in the first place. So if they didn't have the full complement to start off with, then their heart-kidney axis is by definition going to be somewhat weaker to start off. As far as production of inflammation is concerned, that's actually quite a minor one. That causes a particular type of problem, which, as I said, often manifests as thyroid problems or pancreatic problems or reproductive problems, but mostly thyroid and pancreatic. So diabetes, type 2 diabetes, will often be along those lines as well, but most commonly thyroid. But of those three causes of inflammation that we can influence, the primary pathological triad is by far the commonest. And as it turns out, unfortunately, the most difficult to deal with because, the patient has to participate pretty substantially in the process. Whereas in the case of a lingering pathogen, they often don't have to. If you get rid of the pathogen, the problem often will resolve. The patient doesn't have to do anything. So it's quite a different sort of situation.
So lingering pathogen tends to be less of a lifestyle issue.
Very often it does. It depends on exactly the pathogen and where it's located. But certain sorts of pathogens, in fact, the most common pathogens are quite easy to deal with. And if you can dislodge the pathogen from where it's hidden in the body, then homeostasis takes place and the body just looks after itself without the patient having to do exercise or change their diet.
Imagine this. A patient walks into your clinic. They're carrying more than the pain in their body. There's a story there, a history woven with the stress of long days, the ache of things unsaid, and the quiet longing for something to shift. You listen, not just with your ears, but with your hands, your intuition, your heart. It's not just about needles or a formula. It's about connection, understanding the threads that tie us together, mind, body, and spirit. That is where golden flower Chinese herbs comes in. Rooted in tradition and crafted with care, their formulas are more than herbs. They're a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern practice. Every bottle, a quiet partner in your work, helping you to meet your patients where they are. Because healing isn't just about treating symptoms. It's about creating trust, cultivating belonging, and helping someone feel truly seen. Golden Flower Chinese Herbs, your partner in practice and connection, where tradition meets care. Would these lingering pathogens be like from injuries, or would they be from having had a bad cold or a flu? Where do these tend to come from?
Well, the most common is a poorly managed infection. So a wind heat or a wind cold or something along those lines, a lung heat, pathology, it can be anything, it doesn't matter, that was badly managed is a very common cause of a lingering pathogen. And you can think about, it's fairly obvious when you think about it. If you've got a wind heat pathology, for example, from a Chinese medicine point of view, what are you trying to do? You're trying to open the pores up and push the pathogen off the surface and away, get rid of it that way. So you're venting it from the body to the outside. The way that treatment goes now is that people will often resort to antibiotics, for example, or bitter cold herbs, and they have the opposite effect of what we're trying to achieve. Bitter cold substances, of which antibiotics are one type, bitter cold substances, they shut pores, the coldness closes pores and pulls things into the body. We use that when we're using Huang Qin or Da Huang to purge out through the bowel. But that's exactly the opposite of what we're trying to achieve when we're using a venting prescription like Yin Chao San, for example. So a great way to get a lingering pathogen, one of the most common, is to have a bad treatment. A poorly managed acute infection will frequently go on to cause a lingering pathogen. There are many other ways as well. People who go to the gym when they've got something, trying to sweat it out, for example. They've got a finite resource of qi to overcome the pathogens, but if they're burning it up in activity, there's much less left for the immune system to use, and that's another way that pathogens can occur. It's not always the result of an infection. It can be related to medications. Certain medications act like a pathogen on the body. Essentially, what a lingering pathogen is from this perspective is a persistent and abnormal immune response. The immune system is set up to work, and then it doesn't switch off properly. And so that's signaled by a small group of persistent symptoms, which are fairly easy to identify. But basically, regardless of what the etiology is, the immune system, rather than going back to its normal resting phase, is continually doing something which it shouldn't be doing. And this manifests with various sorts of heat.
How do you like to treat these particular lingering pathogens?
You vent them. You have to get them out.
With a more harmonizing? So you go more with venting?
Yes, venting is the way to eliminate a pathogen. It depends on where the pathogen is. This is quite a large topic, as you can imagine.
Well, yes, and it's discussed in the Shanghai Lun quite a bit as well, where sometimes you'll want to get it out, sometimes you'll want to take it in and, through the stool. It depends on which the Liu Jing, the 6 levels it's lodged in.
Yes, and that certainly is a great starting point. But I found it rather confusing when I was confronted with patients who clearly had some sort of post-infectious process. And that's why the whole concept of the lingering pathogen came about essentially as a simplified way of trying to understand what's actually going on with these pathological processes. The Shanghai Lun's a fantastic piece of work, but it didn't clearly reflect what was going on in my clinical practice. And without going into a lot of technical stuff, because it's a huge topic, I teach this, and it takes 2 days to get a start on the lingering pathogen concept. But it's a really important one, and of course, it's really, at least when I was training, it was undervalued and skipped over somewhat. And it took me years of trying to nut out what was going on with some of my more difficult patients to work out that, in fact, what they ended up having was a lingering pathogen. So since then, I've kind of put together a simplified model of how this works, which, again, reflects my own clinical experience. Other people's are going to be quite different because it's going to vary depending on your geographical location, the predominant environment that you're in.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And I live in a temperate, fairly mild climate, and the lingering pathogens tend to reflect that. But it might be different in Russia or, the tropics of Central Africa.
This is one of the amazing things about Chinese medicine is we so have to take the context, not just of the person, but their lifestyle, where they live, all those other influences. It's, it makes it fun and incredibly annoying at times to try to get these things dialed in.
Well, it does. But having said that, I've also taught this lingering pathogen business in different places in the US and in Norway and London, places with quite different climates. And it has been the experience of the participants in the class to have a great deal of recognition of what I was talking about in their own patients. So there's a fair bit of overlap, even with different climactic situations.
So when you're looking to do this venting of the pathogen, are you also at the same time giving some support to the normal qi so you've got something to work with?
Absolutely. You can, and many of the formulas that are of the venting class do exactly that, because you have to not only encourage the pathogen to move from the inside to the outside, which is the main strategy. You got to open the pores, give it an exit point, and then encourage it to move from where it's stuck, which is most commonly the qi level, as it turns out, in my experience, which is lucky because it's actually quite easy to vent a pathogen from the qi level.
What are some of the ways that you like to do that?
Again, it depends on the type of pathogen and where it is within the particular level, because there are different zones within each level. So the qi level, for example, is essentially the zone between the surface, the taiyang, the wei level, and the deeper internal organ systems, the yin and the blood levels. But within that, you've got different levels. So if a pathogen is sitting up quite high within the qi level and is much closer to the surface, it tends to influence the lungs and the tai yin, lungs and colon predominantly, because they're close to the surface. If the pathogen sits down deeper, it tends to influence the spleen a bit more. So you get a lot more gastrointestinal symptomatology. So it depends on where the pathogen is and what type it is. The damp heat pathogens by nature tend to sink down deeper within the levels, because the nature of damp is to sink, whereas straight heat pathogens tend to sit up high because heat tends to rise upwards. So if you're dealing with a straight heat pathogen in the qi level, actually turns out a very easy situation to deal with, even though they can persist for months, if not years. The herbal solution is a thing called Juye Shigaotang.
Juye Shigaotang.
That's the one that I like the best. There are a number of ways to do it, but Juye Shigaotang seems to be the most reliable in my experience. Juye Shigaotang.
So there's Juye, which is a wonderful heat-clearing herb. Shigao, very strongly heat-clearing. What else is in that?
Juye Shigaotang, it also has, let me just refer to my textbooks here. I'll look it up and tell you exactly.
Ah, great. Yeah. It's so funny. After years of practice, I just think of a formula by itself, but don't always think about what's in it.
Yeah. And this is one of those ones because you don't ever modify this. It's never mucked around with. Okay. So it has Danjuye, Shigao, Banxia, Maidong, Renchen, and Jiganxia. So it's a modification of Xiao Chaiyutang, essentially.
Yeah.
And it only appears once. I think it's in clause 116 of the Shanghan Lun. So it's really under regarded in my experience, but I have found it to be highly reliable for this particular problem. It's only used for this particular problem, but I've found consistently if someone has what I diagnose ultimately as a heat pathogen in the qi level, and we give them Juye Shigaotang, then all being equal and without any other complicating factors, within a week or two, the problem is resolved very often.
Wow.
It's quite dramatic in many cases because unless the pathogen is vented in somewhere, it's got to get out. And unless it's gotten out, the whole thing just keeps on kicking on.
And that brings us right back to the beginning of this conversation. You see these patients, they've got this ongoing thing. You can clear some heat. They're better for a while, but it comes back. And so this is what you got to do. You got to really get into that level. Your way of thinking about this is really helpful, that we've got these 3 different places to look and begin to think about, where do I start?
Yeah, I found it very useful. But again, let me just stress that this is my experience and other people's is likely to be different. There's probably other sources of this persistent heat, but ones that, may be more common in, somewhere else. I don't know.
I'm sure that's the case. We all have our own particular clinical gaze, if you will, our way of interacting with things. I find for myself, just in having this conversation with you, that having these 3 sort of buckets to think about, it just opens up lots of possibilities. Are there other ways of looking at it? Are there other ways of going about it? Yes, of course. This just seems really doable, at least given the clinical experience that I've had.
It simplifies the analysis of what is often quite complicated situations. Because very often patients who come in with one of or more of these problems, they've had a problem for some time. They've often been through the medical ringer. They've often medicated. So when they present, there's a lot of different things going on. So this is I've found this helpful as a way of clearing away some of the complexity and getting and focusing my attention, if you like, on the underlying important things that need to be addressed rather than just looking at symptoms and attempting to do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And it's made a big difference. Certainly it doesn't work in every case by any means, but I would say that it's much more satisfactory.
Unless you have some other comments about this, I'd like to turn to your book for a moment.
Sure.
Our friends at Eastland Press are bringing out, tell us a bit about the book. It's a reprinting, as I recall.
It's a second edition.
A second edition, even better.
Yeah, it's a new edition. So it's a fairly substantially expanded edition. What I should say is that the first volume there's 3 books in the original series. The first one came out in 1997, so it's like 20 years old now. And I'd been in practice for 10 years by that stage, and I was still pretty green. After 10 years, you're really pretty green. So the first volume was essentially derived from Chinese source materials. And as I mentioned before, it was a sort of a compilation of lecture notes that I'd been compiling for a number of years for courses that I'd been giving at various schools. But it was after that it really, when you start to get more and more experience, you start to see the disconnect between the Chinese materials and what at least I was seeing in my practice. There wasn't a lot of overlap. So that first volume, I don't think was particularly good in hindsight. I mean, it was helpful by all means. It was certainly a great starting place when you're looking at trying to get a grips with internal medicine pathology. But my thinking on a lot of those problems has really changed a lot since then. So the new edition basically has rewritten the first volume pretty substantially, and the second one also, with the hindsight of 30 years of clinical practice, and the addition of some collaborators as well who have also put their inputs into the new edition. So it's not just mine and Jane Littleton's input anymore. There are other people who have contributed fairly substantially to the text.
Who else has helped out with this?
Well, my partner, Catherine, who's been in practice for about 20 years now. She specialises in women and children's pathologies. Another long-term practitioner, friend of mine called Mark Bailey. These are the main contributors, and their contribution is essentially they've edited the text, they've gone through and pointed out things that they think don't necessarily gel with their experience, enhanced things where they think this is particularly useful, and so on and so forth. Basically, there are other people as well who've contributed little bits and pieces here and there. And ultimately, what I would hope, this would be my ultimate dream, is that a book like this, a big sort of compendium, like an encyclopedia really, becomes the collective work of the profession rather than, the work of a few people. Ideally, the experience of many is compiled into a book that reflects our clinical world in the West, because it's different to China. It's not the same. Our diets, our lifestyles, our habits, our cultural background is different, and this produces different types of pathology. There's no question about that.
Well, I love that you've started with your experience early on teaching. You brought in things that you learned in China. What a great start that was 20 years ago with this book.
Yeah.
And now you've got all kinds of other experience that's baked into this new edition. Along with the experience of other practitioners. Like you said, it's not just you, it's a community of Western practitioners in a sense, or a small community of Western practitioners that have taken this stuff, worked it, distilled it, and now we're going to have the second edition. When does it come out?
Well, we're still working on it, but hopefully this year, all going well. You have this ideal, and things have a way of not really happening like that. But we're 4 years down the track, and I think it's going to have to happen this year. And we're on track for that, I think, at this point.
Like we were talking earlier, it's that last rereads and dotting the I's and crossing the T's. But that's such a huge piece of the book. I mean, anyone who reads a book, I think so often it's easy for us to think, oh yeah, someone just wrote this and, they run it through a spell checker or whatever. But there's so much work that goes into the very end. Unless you've done a book, you just don't know that last bit that takes so long.
Oh yeah. And when you're dealing with a book of thousands of pages, just physically reading it and reading it closely is a huge and demanding task on its own. I should just point out one other thing that's changed in this edition is that the source materials from the first edition and from the first book, the first volume, and the second volume, the source materials that I use from China have improved immensely as well. Right? There's a whole lot of new stuff that's come out in internal medicine in China recently that's really significantly better than the original materials that I was using, and a much broader range of stuff too. So there's the bibliography of this new edition is huge. A lot of really interesting stuff is happening in China as well with Chinese medicine now.
Will, are there any closing thoughts that you have that you'd like to leave us with before we say goodbye here today?
Look, I would say that over the course of my career, I've noted a couple of things in particular. We're getting a lot better at it in general. And I think what that means is we're getting much more familiar with what our strengths and limitations are. So we can focus on the things that we do well rather than trying to do everything and not doing so well. So as a profession, I think we're getting better at identifying what we can do. And that really works into integrating much better into the health system in general. I've never liked the epithet that we go by, which is the alternative medicine set. As far as I'm concerned, there's only medicine, and it either works or it doesn't. In this country, at least, we're getting to the point where we're becoming more just medicine, and we do certain things well. We don't do other things very well, but we're getting recognized for the things that we do well, and we're doing more of it in a much more interesting context within the hospital system from time to time. That's ramping up quite a bit now as it happens.
Yeah, happening in the States as well.
That's one thing that I've noticed, and that's really, I think, incredibly positive. If we can overcome the unrealistic expectations that a lot of practitioners used to have. And when I got out of school in 1987, I didn't know what I could do and what I couldn't do. I'd been told that we could do anything. That just leads to masses of disappointments and pretty poor clinical outcomes when you try to do things you can't really do very well.
Knowing what you can do and what you can't is...
Yeah, that's right.
It's really important.
It was a long learning experience to find out where to focus our talents. And it made for a much more satisfactory clinical experience too when you get good results consistently.
For everybody, the patient and the practitioner.
Absolutely. And we've tried to, I think, incorporate some of that experience into the clinical handbooks too, the new edition in particular, to help to guide people more realistically.
Well, I look forward to reading it. It's one thing to read the stuff from China, and then it's another thing to read a Westerner's actual clinical experience.
Yeah.
Will, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being on Qiological today. Maybe we'll do a part 2 sometime. Maybe after the book comes out, we can
yeah, sure.
sit down and dig into something there.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Well, here we are at the end of this episode. If you've listened up to this point, you're either a rabid fan of Qiological or the forward button on your podcast player stopped working. If you are indeed a fan of the podcast, you can help us to bring new episodes to our community of practitioners by supporting us with a membership or a one-time contribution. Details, of course, are on the website. That's it for today, friends. Join us again next Tuesday for another thoughtful episode of Qiological.